Warhammer the Old World is not getting a starter box, and the question is that a mistake or not? I personally think it's probably not the right direction, but let's talk about it. So for those of you who missed it, at Warhammer Fest last week, there was a Q&A that wasn't actually shown on Twitch or anywhere like that. And one of the questions that was apparently asked was about a starter box. And the GW employees, Eddie and the other guy's name who temporarily escapes me, they were basically saying there won't be a starter box. Now this was initially taken by a lot of people to mean that there wouldn't actually be a launch box. That was not what they intended. What they were saying is that there won't be a starter box in the sense that there won't be a box that is trying to get new players into the game. Their opinion is that Warhammer the Old World will be for more seasoned gamers, which on the surface I think sort of makes sense. Let's be real, games like Age of Sigmar and 40k, they're not necessarily as complicated as Warhammer Fantasy used to be. Now I'm not calling those games simple by any means, but it sort of makes sense. You could argue that Warhammer Fantasy you maybe need more models, you maybe even need more space these days. There's a few reasons to think it might not be a good starter game, and I actually sort of agree with that. If you're starting out wargaming, you probably want to start with one of the skirmish games like Kill Team, Warcry, Star Wars Shatterpoint, whatever, right? But let's look at the reason why this game is even coming back in the first place. A lot of people, myself included, sort of think that the Total War games is part of the reason. Now the Total War games are video games. These are not your average war gamer, your tabletop war gamer. So on one hand, GW are positioning this game as being for the more hardcore war gamers or the more experienced war gamers, if you will. But on the other hand, a lot of us think that the game is actually coming back because of a large portion of people who may not have actually played a war game before. Now, I would argue that the Total War games are like strategy games. You're probably able to quickly pick up the game if you're playing that game to like any kind of serious level. But still, I mean, I don't necessarily think how relevant that is. So we're in this sort of like weird ground right now. The truth is, we're probably going to get a box like the Horus Heresy got. It's probably going to be a slightly more expensive box, and it's probably going to have a lot more miniatures in it. Now, what's actually in that box, we obviously don't know at the moment. It's heavily implied that the launch box will actually be Tomb Kings versus Bretonnians. That's what they had at Warhammer Fest. They actually had a picture that said Tomb Kings versus Bretonnians, but it never actually said launch box or starter box or anything like that. It just said that those were the two factions they would focus on. Now they did say versus, which sounds like a small deal, but they could have just said, hey, we're focusing on Bretonnians and Tomb Kings, but that's not the vibe. They're actually focusing on them competing with each other. Therefore it sort of makes sense that they will be the launch box. However, for maybe absolutely no reason whatsoever, I sort of believe it still might not be the launch box, or maybe they're going to do something else. I think they could end up with a situation where they do several launch boxes, and I actually don't mean launch boxes there, maybe just 2-player boxes. For example, maybe 3 months later or 6 months later or something like that, maybe they'll do 2 other factions, which obviously they said they're going to do these 2 factions versus each other. Maybe they're planning the next 2 factions after that, and maybe they'll also have a box, a little bit like Kill Team and stuff like that. I don't actually follow those games, but maybe like Kill Team has a box every so often, doesn't it? Maybe the Old World will be like that for the first year. It would sort of make sense and maybe make GW a lot of money. So in that way, I can definitely see it happening. But either way, that launch box is probably going to be similar to Horus Heresy, and it'll have everything that you need to play the game. It'll have the rule book, you'll probably have the whippy sticks maybe, and the templates, because you sort of need them for the game, so I think it will make sense. They're just not going to have a book that sort of says, hey, you play a war game like this in a very basic way. So I don't actually think the impact of not having a launch box will be all that big, but I don't necessarily agree with the positioning that GW are taking. Just because of that audience that we're actually trying to attract, the Total War Warhammer gamers, I think there's room there to be like, hey, you guys can come in and come in this way. Now, I actually think they're right in that I don't think the Old World is actually going to be a good game to get started with. It would have been nice if they sort of had the same kind of aesthetic, i.e. the Old World, but in a different game. Maybe like a more skirmish form. Now, they're not going to do this at launch. Mordheim would maybe be the perfect game that could come back, but obviously they're not really planning that at the minute, or they're at least not willing to talk about that at the minute. But I would like to see maybe rules for like a proper Warhammer skirmish. Now, there has been a couple of different variations of like skirmish based Warhammer the Old World, i.e. Warhammer Fantasy at different points. Can't necessarily remember them all off the top of my head, but I wouldn't mind if they actually changed the unit size and they changed the points and they're like, hey, have some 500 point games and it looks like this. They could do that and still not have a starter box. It would maybe be a little bit contradictory, but I actually think it would be a good idea. Ultimately, I don't think it's going to matter that much. I think when Warhammer the Old World is ready to have its hype train, that hype train is going to be very, very big. Like, I really believe that most of the content creators on YouTube who do like wargaming, a lot of them will actually be talking about it. It's just got that insane momentary hype potential. Now, that's not to say that this game will then go on and push on to, you know, go past Age of Sigmar or anything like that. I think the game itself probably just not user-friendly enough for that. The games take many hours, there's a lot of models, there's a lot of rules, they're not simplifying it in any way. Like, I think the game itself just won't necessarily be that popular, except I think the aesthetic of it will be, because that's what a lot of people love, and I think there will be a hardcore player base that will just linger around until GW decide to close it again, if that ever happens. And I'm okay with that, right? I think that's completely fine. There's an alternative reality that could happen there, where like the Old World is just so popular, maybe even I'm underestimating it, and it actually overtakes Age of Sigmar, and like GW are all in a fuss. I really don't see that happening, and I don't necessarily think GW want that to happen. A lot of people, again myself included here, we're sort of getting the vibe that GW, they don't want the Old World to be that big mega success. Now, I don't think what the reveals at Warhammer Fest really showed that. I think I made a video talking about why they're actually just not ready to show you the hype and the launch box yet, because it's too early. But I don't think Games Workshop are positioning this game as a replacement to Age of Sigmar. They pretty much don't want that to happen. What they want is for it to be maybe like the third or the fourth game behind Horus Heresy, and then they just want to sell the IP probably to video game makers and stuff like that. And all the while, they'll milk the hardcore players dry. But if they make the stuff that I like, I'm happy to be milked. But I do think they are then trying to balance that hype train. They don't want it to be that big, but I think they won't be able to stop it. At launch, it'll be absolutely insanely big. Probably not quite as big as like a 10th edition of Warhammer 40k, but it'll be big enough. It'll be the next thing closest to a new edition of 40k without a new edition of 40k. I think it'll be even more hyped than a new edition of Age of Sigmar, but that's not to say that the game itself will then be bigger than Age of Sigmar. I think it will then trail off quite rapidly, actually. But yeah, I think the lack of a starter box sounds like it's going to be a major thing, and I think it sort of is a little bit of a mistake, but I don't actually think it's that important in the long run. I do wish that they sort of introduce a skirmishy based game, be it Mordheim or something, just to give players a little bit of an incentive to get in there, because wargaming just in general, if you're not doing a skirmish game, they're very hard to start. And it's very off-putting when you look at all of the models that you need to play, and you need to spend all the time like assembling them and painting them and stuff like that. Anything that makes that easier is good in my eyes. So for me, it's a mistake. I just don't think it's that big of a mistake, and I don't think it'll have that big of an impact. But it's funny that they're willing to just say that out loud. At least we know where they're aiming for, right? It gives us an idea what they actually want. So we can't say that they didn't warn us, because they have done. If you want to support the channel, I want to give a big shout out to my 3 Patreons. Thank you very much to you guys. If you want to support me and become a Patreon, there is a link in the description below. Other than that, I hope you have a most beautiful day. Like and subscribe. Goodbye.